An elderly couple is dead in their apartment tonight. Not soldiers, not military personnel, not combatants of any kind. A husband and a wife in their home in Ramat Gan, a suburb of Tel Aviv, killed by a weapon that the United States banned from use in populated civilian areas, a weapon that the Geneva Convention's additional protocols specifically address because of its indiscriminate nature, a weapon called a cluster munition. And the reason they are dead tonight is not just the missile that killed them. The reason they are dead tonight is a weapon design that was specifically engineered to maximize casualties across the widest possible civilian area. Not a precision strike, not a targeted hit, a weapon that opens in the air and releases hundreds of smaller submunitions across a radius large enough to cover an entire city neighborhood, and then leaves behind unexploded remnants on the ground for years after the war ends that continue killing people who were not even born when the weapon was dropped. Iran fired this weapon into one of the most densely populated urban areas on Earth last night. CNN witnessed what appeared to be cluster munitions detonating over central Israel, multiple impact sites across Tel Aviv and Ramat Gan, an elderly couple dead in their home, and the international community is only beginning to calculate what this means for the legal and moral framework of this war. My name is Professor Jiang. I study geopolitics and predictive military analysis, and I want to be completely direct with you right now. This video is not about taking sides in this war. I do not cover this conflict through the lens of who deserves to win. I cover it through the lens of what the data and the history and the law actually say, and what all three of those things say about last night is something that every viewer needs to understand, because cluster munitions are not just another weapon. They are a category of weapon that the international community spent decades specifically trying to eliminate, and last night they came back in a city of 4 million. People dropped by a government that is simultaneously accusing its adversaries of war crimes. Stay with me, because in the next 9 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what cluster munitions do that makes them categorically different from other weapons. I'm going to show you the specific legal framework that governs them and why that framework matters for this war. I'm going to show you what the historical record says about what happens to military campaigns that use them on civilian populations. And I am going to give you the specific prediction about where this goes next that nobody on television is willing to say clearly. Most people hear the phrase cluster munitions and do not have a precise picture of what that weapon actually does. And without that picture, you cannot fully understand why last night was different from every other missile strike in this 19-day war. A standard ballistic missile carries one warhead, it hits one location, it creates one blast radius, the damage is terrible and specific. A cluster munition missile is engineered differently. It carries a payload of submunitions, typically between 200 and 600 individual bomblets depending on the specific variant. The missile opens at a predetermined altitude over the target area. The bomblets disperse across a coverage zone that can extend from 1 to several square kilometers depending on the release altitude and the specific weapon design. Each individual bomblet then detonates independently on impact. The coverage of a single cluster munition strike over a dense urban area like Ramat Gan or central Tel Aviv is therefore not one explosion in one location. It is hundreds of explosions spread across multiple city blocks simultaneously, street level, rooftops, balconies, parks, schoolyards, any outdoor space within the dispersal radius. Receives submunitions. Any person in an outdoor space within that radius during the strike has no protection. But here is the part that makes cluster munitions uniquely horrifying even compared to other indiscriminate weapons. The failure rate. Independent studies by the International Committee of the Red Cross and Human Rights Watch have documented that between 10 and 40% of cluster submunitions do not detonate on initial impact. They land, they sit, they wait in gardens, in schoolyards, under debris, on rooftops, in drains, looking sometimes like small metallic objects that children pick up out of curiosity. And then they detonate days later, months later, years later, long after the war that dropped them has ended. The landmine crisis in Southeast Asia that the international community spent 30 years and billions of dollars trying to remediate was caused substantially by cluster munition remnants from the American bombing campaigns of the 1970s. In Cambodia today, 50 years after those bombs fell, people are still being killed by unexploded submunitions from a war that ended before most of the victims were born. Lebanon has cluster munition casualties from the 2006 war that are still being recorded in 2026. The weapon does not stop killing when the war stops. That is the specific feature of cluster munitions that makes them categorically different from every other weapon in this conflict. Now let me give you the legal framework, because this is where last night becomes not just a military event but a legal and political event with consequences for this war's diplomatic trajectory. 111 countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which entered into force in 2010. This treaty prohibits the production, transfer, stockpiling, and use of cluster munitions entirely. Iran has not signed this treaty. Israel has not signed this treaty. The United States has not signed this treaty. Russia has not signed this treaty. China has not signed this treaty. The countries that signed it are largely the countries that do not intend to use them in conflict. The countries that did not sign are largely the ones that do. However, signing the convention is not the only legal standard that applies. Even for non-signatories, customary international humanitarian law, the body of rules that apply to all parties in all conflicts regardless of treaty status, includes the principle of distinction, the requirement to distinguish between civilian and military targets, the principle of proportionality, the requirement that the anticipated civilian harm not be excessive relative to the military advantage gained, and the principle of precaution, the requirement to take all feasible measures to avoid or minimize civilian casualties. Firing cluster munitions into a metropolitan area of 4 million people fails all three of these customary law standards simultaneously, not arguably, not as a matter of legal interpretation, as a matter of weapon physics. A weapon that disperses hundreds of submunitions across multiple city blocks in a civilian metropolitan area cannot distinguish between military and civilian targets by design. It is physically incapable of doing so. The weapon's coverage radius is larger than any conceivable military target in an urban residential area. The proportion of civilian harm is therefore inherently excessive relative to any military advantage, and the deployment of a weapon with a documented 10 to 40% dud rate in a densely populated area fails the precautionary principle at the most basic level. This is why the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction over war crimes includes cluster munition use in civilian areas, and this is why last night's strike opens a dimension of this war that goes beyond military strategy into international criminal law. Now I want to show you the historical pattern because this is where my analysis, as a geopolitical predictor, adds something that straight legal analysis does not. Every military force that has used cluster munitions in urban civilian areas in a modern conflict has faced one specific consequence that was not immediately apparent at the time of use but became decisive within 6 to 18 months. The political cost of the imagery and the documentation overwhelmed the military advantage of the weapon. In the 2006 Lebanon War, Israel used cluster munitions extensively in southern Lebanon in the final 72 hours of the conflict. Human Rights Watch documented the strikes. The UN Mine Action Coordination Center documented the casualties. The international political backlash that followed was identified by Israeli defense ministry analysts themselves as one of the primary factors that damaged Israel's diplomatic positioning in the subsequent decade. The military advantage gained from those strikes in those 72 hours was assessed as marginal. The political cost was measured in years of damaged relationships with European and non-aligned nations. The United States used cluster munitions in Iraq in 2003. The documented civilian casualties from cluster munition remnants in Iraqi cities in the years following the invasion became a specific and sustained element of the international criticism of the military campaign. The American military subsequently conducted extensive internal reviews, and the Department of Defense issued new policies restricting cluster munition use specifically because of the political and diplomatic costs of the Iraqi documentation. Iran is not a sophisticated enough diplomatic actor to have calculated these historical precedents with precision, but the pattern says the same thing happened to every state actor that used this weapon in modern urban warfare. The short-term military messaging value, demonstrating the ability to strike deep into Israeli territory with an indiscriminate area weapon, is immediately offset by the documentation, because in 2026 the documentation is instantaneous. CNN witnessed it in real time. The impact sites are being photographed by thousands of civilians with smartphones. The dud submunitions are being found and photographed on rooftops and in gardens across Ramat Gan right now, and every photograph is time-stamped and geodaged and uploaded to platforms that the ICC's evidence-gathering procedures are fully capable of incorporating. Iran created last night a documentary record of its own war crime in real time, and that record will be used in international legal and political forums for years after this war ends. I want to now address the specific strategic question that this development creates for the arc of this war, because last night's cluster munition strike changes the diplomatic mathematics in a way that is not obvious from the military reporting. Before last night, the international criticism of this war was split. America and Israel were facing sustained international pressure over civilian casualties in Iran. The Amnesty International report on the Minab school strike had created serious diplomatic damage. Multiple countries had recalled their ambassadors from Washington. The UN General Assembly was preparing a resolution calling for a ceasefire. The moral and legal narrative of this war, which matters enormously for the diplomatic sustainability of any military campaign, was trending against the American and Israeli position. Last night's cluster munition strike over Tel Aviv just changed that narrative's balance point, not eliminated the criticism of America and Israel, but created a documented countervailing atrocity that gives every country currently pressuring Washington something they must now also say publicly about Iran, the countries that were preparing to vote for the UN ceasefire resolution without mentioning Iranian war crimes now have to decide whether they can do that with credibility after cluster munitions were fired into a civilian metropolitan area and an elderly couple died in their apartment. This is the perverse strategic arithmetic of atrocity in modern warfare. Each documented war crime by one side forces a recalibration of every neutral party's public positioning, and Iran, whether intentionally or through the desperation of a government that has lost its supreme leader, its security chief, its intelligence minister, and its bossage commander in 19 days, has just handed every country currently criticizing America and Israel a reason to also publicly criticize Iran. The ceasefire resolution that was building momentum at the UN this week just became significantly harder to pass in its current form. Not because cluster munitions over Tel Aviv justify anything that happened at Minab school. They do not. Two documented atrocities are not a moral equivalence, but in the political arithmetic of the United Nations General Assembly, documented reciprocal atrocity creates a parliamentary dynamic where the resolution must acknowledge both or be vetoed as politically one-sided, and a resolution acknowledging both takes months of negotiation to draft, months during which the war continues. This is the third and most important analytical point I want to leave with you today. Last night's cluster munition strike may have been militarily motivated by Iran's need to demonstrate that it can still reach deep into Israeli territory despite 19 days of bombardment, but its most significant consequence may be the diplomatic. 1. By creating documented evidence of its own use of a banned weapon in civilian areas, Iran reduced the international community's ability to build the unified diplomatic pressure on America and Israel that was the most realistic path toward a ceasefire this week. A government with a sophisticated diplomatic strategy would never have made this calculation. A government run by ERG military commanders following the death of every senior official who might have counseled diplomatic sophistication might make exactly this calculation, demonstrate military reach at the cost of diplomatic position. Because the ERG commanders controlling this war right now do not have a diplomatic strategy. They have a military one, and military strategies that use cluster munitions in civilian cities tell you something fundamental about the strategic judgment of the people executing them. The morning shows will cover last night as a military escalation story. Cluster bombs over Tel Aviv, casualties in Ramat Gan, Israeli retaliation expected. They will report the facts and move to the next segment. They will not show you the legal analysis. They will not show you the historical pattern. They will not show you the diplomatic consequence at the UN. And they will not show you what an elderly couple dying in their apartment from a weapon with a 40% dud rate tells you about the decision-making quality of the government that fired it. Now you have all of it. Subscribe right now if this gave you a framework for this war that goes beyond the daily strike reports. Every day I take the hardest, most uncomfortable stories in this conflict and show you what they actually mean beyond the headline. Drop a comment below. Tell me honestly, do you believe Iran's use of cluster munitions over Tel Aviv will change the international diplomatic momentum toward a ceasefire, or will it be dismissed as just another escalation? I read every single comment. I will see you tomorrow.